Tonight's speaker is Dr. Mandaville, Peter Mandaville. He's the director of the Oliver Center for Global Islamic Students at George Mason University. And he's the founding director of the Center for Global Studies at the university. In 2011 and 12, he served as a member of the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's policy planning staff at the U.S. Department of State, where his portfolio focused on U.S. policy in the Middle East. Born and raised in the Middle East, the third generation of his family to live there, his recent research has taken him to a wide range of Muslim settings, such as Pakistan, Indonesia, Malaysia, and West Africa. He is most recently the author of Global Political Islam. Other books include Transnational Muslim Politics, as well as several volumes of edited essays and all sorts of other articles. Peter has also appeared before Congress a number of times, and on TV, and you see him in the New York Times and other newspapers commenting. He happens to be a 1990 graduate of this school. He went on to St. Andrews, did his PhD at the University of Kent at Canterbury, England. And before he begins his presentation, he may say a few words about his personal life and the serendipitous way that he found himself talking to Hillary Clinton, or found himself as a professor at a university in the United States. Peter was a wonderful student when he was here. He was in our school plays. He was a lead in Othello. He also happened to be a good musician and part of a band, and he could rock and roll with the best of them. Now, I guess he'd rap as the new thing. Anyway, let's welcome back an illustrious alumnus, Peter Mandaville.
Hey, good evening, everybody. How are you all doing? Good, great. Well, I'm always so happy to come back to Blair, which was, let me get sentimental for a second. This was kind of like home for me, because at the time that I was a student here, my family was living in the Middle East. So, mom and dad and friends are 6,000, 7,000 miles away. And so Blair kind of became the second home for me. And it's always such a pleasure to come back here. As Marty said, I went on from Blair to study at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. I was an international relations major there. And something I would encourage you to think about. It's hardly natural that you imagine yourself going on to some college here in the States, but there's a whole world of higher education out there. Great way to expand your horizons. Fantastic high-quality programs. So, when it comes to that moment, when you're doing the college choice thing, think big, expand your horizons. As Marty mentioned, I also recently took a leave of absence from the university that I teach at, my day job, if you will, to serve in government at the State Department. And it just so happened that my time there coincided with all of these dramatic events that went down in the Middle East in 2011. Now, a lot of friends of mine have noticed that my first day at the State Department was the day that the revolution in Egypt started, and they sort of, accused me of somehow being involved in it. It's actually kind of funnier than that, because my job there was set up months and months and months before any of this went down. Even once you get a government job, you have to go through the whole process of getting a security clearance, which can take a long time, particularly if you've lived in odd parts of the world, as I had. So my stuff there was set up a year before any of this happened. And what I was going to work on was just a totally hypothetical what-if project focused on the question of the possibility somewhere down the line, 2013, 14, 15, 20, 2020, maybe something might politically begin to change in the Middle East. And how should the U.S. react to that? Lo and behold, all of this stuff starts happening the day I started at the State Department. And literally 48 hours after I start there, they plunk me down in front of Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and tell me to tell her what to do about the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Just nerve-wracking, right? Because as an academic, I'm comfortable and used to writing kind of out-of-the-box hypothetical pieces that, don't really have any consequences. It's free space to just kind of think. But then suddenly I'm in a position where the things that I say to a senior decision maker potentially have some real impact. I wish I could say that I sort of, gave her very pithy advice, that she followed to the letter and everything went well. Actually, for the first few minutes, I couldn't get over how big her head was. I don't know if you've seen pictures of Hillary Clinton on TV. She has a very big head, and I'm sitting across the table from her. So for the first minute, I'm just like, oh my God, that's Hillary Clinton, that's Hillary Clinton. I'm sitting across the table from Hillary Clinton. And for the next 5 minutes, I'm like, oh my God, your head is so big. Why is your head so big? And so finally, once I got passed out, I was actually able to talk to her about, Middle East policy. So here's what I want to do this evening. And I really don't want to talk at you for too long of a time, because I want us to have plenty of time to kind of talk together, get into stuff, discuss, hear your thoughts, your questions on these issues. I want to just kind of frame these happenings for you, give my take on what this was all about and what I think it means for our country and for the future of that region. And kind of following the maxim, the dictum, that a picture is worth 1,000 words, I'm going to do this mainly by showing you a series of images of revolutionary street art, graffiti, that appeared throughout most of the countries that experienced it, particularly Egypt, during this period, and use those graffiti, that street art, as a device to kind of tell the story. Does anyone recognize that fist up there? Anyone seen that fist before? This is yes. It's not specifically used by the Muslim Brotherhood. It's a protest fist that has been used by any number of movements that have sought to overthrow dictators from Central and Eastern Europe, to Latin America, to the Middle East over the last 10 years. This particular one is from the logo of a group called the April 6th Movement, which was one of the key groups that worked to get people out in the streets during those fateful days of January and February last year. This is a group that had been around for several years by that point, working quietly, building up energy, building up constituencies and audiences, getting planted in people's minds the idea that change, once imagined as impossible, might actually be possible in Egypt. A moment of geography, then I promise we'll move from maps to cool images, just to give you a sense of the range of countries and what part of the world we're talking about here. This is a map of the Middle East, and as you can see, all of these countries that are colored are places that, to one degree or another, last year, and in some cases up until this very day, have experienced some level of unrest, protest, popular revolt against the governments of those countries. The darker shaded countries are the ones where the more revolutionary things happen. Egypt and Tunisia here being the most important. Tunisia is where it all started in December of 2010. Egypt went next, and this map's a little old. July of last year, by the next month, August, Libya had also gone. So these three countries all experienced revolutions. But of course we have a change of government in Yemen as well. We have, ongoing to this very day, popular protests that have now effectively become a civil war in Syria. And in other countries, people to varying degrees are out on the streets. So I just want to make sure to communicate to you that this isn't just sort of an isolated, something happens in one country. This is a region-wide phenomenon. Here's what I want to do next. I want to introduce the flavors, if you will, of this revolution by showing you essentially a hip-hop video. It's by a Tunisian artist called El General. And he produced this video in December 2010, put it out on YouTube, and it got dozens then hundreds, then thousands, then hundreds of thousands of viewers in Tunisia. And a few weeks later, he was arrested, thrown in jail, incommunicado, for several weeks. Because what he's doing in this video, which is called Rais al-Bilad, means President of the Nation, he's basically unloading vitriol at then President Ben Ali of Tunisia, explaining in a sort of monologue, imagine, between him and the president, what's wrong with his rule, what's wrong with the country. Thankfully, there's a translation that you'll see. It's not the best translation, but you'll get the general idea. And this will give you a sense of what kinds of issues were on people's minds, what sorts of grievances, what the kind of main complaints that people had were. You're going to see that it actually opens with a little clip of a movie of the then president, Ben Ali, at a school, talking to a school child, trying to be sort of the big father figure. And you can see that the kid is just terrified. It just does not want to engage with him at all. So here we go. El General, So if anybody wants the MP3, happy to give you a copy. So then we have the images that we all saw so dramatically on television in the following months. Hundreds of thousands and then millions of people gathering in the central squares of cities like Cairo, Egypt, Tahrir Square, Egyptians from all walks of life gathering together to express the core sentiment that you heard El General laying out there. The idea that the people just had enough. Enough of the corruption, the nepotism, the socioeconomic inequality, the way that the government effectively treated their citizens as if they were trash, objects to be toyed with. And that's really the core of what this was about. Wasn't people looking to create a society with some different ideology? Wasn't about pro-democracy, pro-capitalism, pro-Islam even though you might think otherwise in light of ensuing events. But this was, at its core, essentially a rejection of the existing political system. Plain and simple. Now, you saw those events on television. This all plays out. But to my mind, the real story begins after those events. So I want to do a whistle-stop tour, 5 minutes, using images that will kind of take you through the key events. And then I want to say something about what this means for the US. This mural, which appeared in Cairo a couple of weeks after the fall of Hosni Mubarak, to my mind, kind of says it all. Look at the various elements here. You've got the idea of the chains, the neck chain around the citizen's head being broken open by a combination of SMS, text messaging, right? Facebook, right? We all heard so much about the role of Twitter and Facebook and social media in letting all of this happen. And then the idea of cross-religious interfaith unity, the crescent symbol of Islam, the cross, both being held up together, because Egypt, of course, has both Muslims and Christians. The majority of Muslims, to the tune of about 90%, but there's about a 10% of the population that's Coptic Christian. And this unity stays the hand of the oppressor with the whip, right? So this kind of summarizes the core impulse behind all of this. Now, you'd think that with this prominent role of technology, Twitter, Facebook, American companies, right, that there might be a sense in which, the United States is seen in a positive light, as somehow having helped to facilitate this by providing some of the tools that allow this to happen. But there's a much broader context in which you have to understand this. I think it's best summarized by this image from Tahrir Square, in the middle of Cairo. This is the Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurant in Tahrir Square. And someone had spray painted on it. This Arabic here says, "No to Mubarak," who was the president of Egypt at the time, "No to Mubarak, client of America." And this speaks to the widespread, for good reason, perception on the part of the Egyptian people that the very government that they were in the process of overthrowing is one that had been propped up, facilitated, aided, funded in crucial ways by the United States. And so the Egyptian people were not, and to this day, are not quite ready yet, in the aftermath of the overthrow of the Hosni Mubarak regime, to warmly embrace the United States, after decades and decades of our country facilitating the dictatorship, the authoritarianism that they lived in. And this, in many ways, is the core conundrum that we face in the region today. In many ways, our country was quite happy with the old rules, the old way of doing business. We had certain leaders that did work for us, helped to organize our interests in the region, and now suddenly those people are gone. And moreover, they were thrown out by popular revolutions in the name of democracy, which of course, given our values, we have to support. We end up being torn between those strategic interests on the one hand and the need to support the popular will of the people on the other. Now a few images of sort of street art that speak to ensuing events. This is an image of a military police officer. He's saying. This appeared in some of the upper middle class, well-to-do suburbs of Cairo, populated by the kind of people who weren't necessarily so willing to get out into the streets to overthrow Hosni Mubarak, because they were people who were essentially protected by him, the well-to-do, the privileged classes of Egypt. It says there in Arabic, "Your silence serves my interests," trying to communicate the idea that if people don't get behind the revolution and continue to be willing to support the ongoing presence in the country of special intelligence security forces whose loyalty lay with the old regime, then they run the risk of bringing that old regime right back. Similar kind of message here. This is an image of the chief of military intelligence that showed up overnight, spray painted, stenciled all across Cairo, saying, "Know thy enemy." Basically telling people, look, you overthrew the dictator, you overthrew Hosni Mubarak, but don't forget that some of the people who are now in charge of running the country, after Mubarak left, it was the military that essentially ran Egypt for the next year. Some of those people were complicit with him in committing a lot of the oppression that the revolution was aimed at. This is a great image. Look at the juxtaposition here. This is sort of the rallying symbol of the activists. And essentially what's being said here is, your camera is a weapon. It's the idea that popular protesters out on the streets who were continuing to struggle on a daily basis with the country's security forces, they're not armed. They don't have guns, but they have cameras in their cell phones. The idea being that when you see violence being committed against the people by the security forces, record it. Get evidence. We can use the internet to put that out there and show what's going on. That camera you hold is a weapon. Now, as events played out over the next year, those of you who follow the news will not have failed to recognize the fact that politics in Egypt began to take on a distinctly religious, more specifically Islamic flavor over the course of the next year, with the Muslim Brotherhood, a political and social movement that had been in existence in Egypt for close to 80 years, but heavily oppressed by the previous government, winning phenomenally at the ballot box, almost winning a majority of the country's parliament. If you combine their share of the parliament with that of the ultra-conservative Salafi groups in Egypt, you get a distinctly Islamic flavor in Egyptian politics. I wasn't able to show you Muslim Brotherhood street art just because they don't tend to do street art. They consider it defacing the city. But this guy here, this is Mohammed Morsi, Muslim Brotherhood member, and now the president of Egypt, being supported here by a number of religious leaders. So this Islamic thing comes on board. And then those who are kind of part of the energy that drove this revolution start to debate with each other about what's going on. Some argue that the greatest threat is still the military that's running the country. So this is an image that shows, this is the idea of the military general, the cat, as the puppet master, just controlling all of the politicians. The idea is that even though you have on the face of it elections, new officials, a new government being elected, the idea being that behind the scenes, the military, many of whom are still products of the old regime, are controlling things, running the show. On the other hand, there are others who argue that no, in fact, the military has struck a deal with and is itself being taken over by the religious forces. And so this is Field Marshal Tantawi, who effectively ran Egypt, the highest ranking military official in the country, who ran it for most of last year, and here he's been depicted with a beard, the typical ultra-conservative Salafi-style beard. So the idea being communicated here is that now even the military is being taken over by these religious forces. But at the end of the day, This is where we are right now. I'm going to end my series of images here not with a striking picture, but just some words. As Egypt goes through this period of uncertainty, with a new president in place, with the military, in theory, out of politics, but with everyone believing that they're still behind the scenes, able to re-exert themselves if the religiously controlled government takes things in the wrong direction. What guarantee does this revolution have of continuing to express the popular will of the people? And those who remain hopeful will often use this as a slogan. El-Shab Khat Ahmar. The people are a red line. The idea is that at the end of the day, the Egyptian people showed that they were capable, that they no longer had the fear of going out into the streets in the millions when they felt that their rights were being taken from them. So the idea here is that even if the Muslim Brotherhood, perhaps in concert with even more conservative religious forces to their political right, pull the country in a disastrous direction, even if the military tries to reassert itself, people know now that the citizens of Egypt and of Tunisia, other countries in the region, are willing to go out onto the streets and claim their country back. And that's kind of the hope that those who continue to monitor this situation have to deal with. If you followed headlines in the recent days, you'll know that there's been some turbulence that's entered the picture, where in countries such as Libya, where the United States played such a key role in enabling the military intervention that led to the downfall of longtime dictator Muammar al-Gaddafi. Our embassy our consulate in the eastern city of Benghazi was stormed, and our ambassador there, someone I had the privilege of working with while I was at the State Department, Chris Stevens, was killed. The idea being that, wow, maybe this is all going in the wrong direction. Maybe this isn't how things have played out. Maybe we should have just kept to that nice, safe system that we've been used to for so long. And my reaction to this is to say, essentially, stay the course. It's inevitable when a tightly wound system of that sort, of authoritarianism, of dictatorship, unravels, that there's going to be instability. You don't produce vibrant, pluralistic, liberal democracies overnight. It just doesn't happen. When you go from being a closed society to being an open society, all range of voices can be heard and will exert themselves. The hope is that over time, the center of society holds and evens out the extremes. So we will, inevitably, go through these periods of turbulence as these countries feel their way to a new equilibrium. That's not the main concern I have. The main concern I have is the question of whether this country and its foreign policy machinery, its foreign policy apparatus, that has for so long kind of internalized a certain way of doing business with this region, it has the preferred partners and leaders that it wants to work with. Can it get its head around tectonic change of this sort? And can we reposition ourselves over time so that people will understand this country not to be enablers of authoritarianism and dictatorship, but a country that at the end of the day ended up on the right side of history, supporting the popular will of the citizens of these countries. So I think I will leave it at that. And I think we've got a good 20 minutes or so at least for me to kind of hear your thoughts, your ideas, your questions, your feedback. So please have at it. Yes?
I'm actually got evidence here. I was wondering, that chart, the reference picture that you had, map,
Yeah.
is it typical for the countries that go through that you think that would be banned at the end?
No, that's really good. Actually, can you progress towards revolution, that a country starts in a lighter color and moves through the others. It just hasn't played out that way, right? In some countries went from 0 protests to the fall of the government in a very short period of time. Egypt went from seemingly quiet stability on January 24th to Hosni Mubarak stepping down from power 14 days later. Just unimaginable. If you told some Egyptian on January 24th that in less than a month the president would be gone, they would have laughed in your face and asked you what you were drinking or smoking or whatever. It just wasn't deemed possible. Other countries have gone off in different directions. And speaking to the question you raised, what you saw is a situation where regional leaders watched what happened in Tunisia and Egypt very carefully. Other leaders in countries like Syria who knew that they were possibly under threat, and so they, in a sense, learned from the mistakes of those other leaders and started to take steps to insulate themselves from the same kinds of dynamics. So by the time Hosni Mubarak was out of power, Bashar al-Assad in Egypt, or in Syria, was already putting in place measures with respect to how he regulated the internet, the way that he used certain forms of coercion and reconnaissance and surveillance in order to make it much more difficult for people in Syria to organize. So there was a learning effect that allowed other leaders to kind of, learn from the mistakes of the others. That said, there was also a lot of learning effect on the part of the citizens of these different countries, right? People in Egypt were very keenly watching what was happening in Tunisia. There was direct communication on Facebook between activists in Tunisia and activists in Egypt, right? The people in Tunisia had just been through overthrowing their leader at the time that things began to gather steam in Egypt. So if you looked on Facebook, you would see them talking to each other. They'd say, when they shoot tear gas at you, here's what you should do. Here's how you can protect yourself. So, there was not just leaders learning from other leaders as they fell, but there were also citizens of certain countries learning from other citizens as they went through their protests. But by way of short answer to your question, I don't think there's any inevitable linear progress, right, from initial protests to full revolution, right? In some countries, and Syria unfortunately being one of them, that unraveling of the old order may end up leading effectively to civil war rather than to a popular revolution. I think it's very important to look at the circumstances of each country in order to figure out what the range of possibilities and scenarios. Yes?
I don't know that it's nowhere near the Middle East, but how do you think this will get China, because their government's so famous for their really intensive censorship, and since they're particularly famous for how everything's through Twitter, everything's through Facebook, and also just the fact that all these really powerful leaders from the power and so on are getting overthrown, I think the Chinese government and people will react to it or are reacting.
You may think it has nothing to do with the region, but Hillary Clinton actually asked us exactly the same question you just asked within a week or so after this all happened. She said, look, can you guys go look at other countries that are seen as controlling and authoritarian and see how they're reacting to this? As a way of trying to get a sense of which countries feel vulnerable to the same kinds of forces. And so absolutely, you saw the Chinese government take all kinds of steps in the immediate aftermath of this, through the same kinds of learning that I just mentioned here. Making sure that freedom of assembly in certain regions and provinces where there were known to be tensions, that freedom was curtailed to make sure people can't organize in the same way. We saw the same thing in Zimbabwe. There are all sorts of other countries totally disconnected from this region, but where the political circumstances are roughly the same. So, we pay a lot of attention to that. At the same time, however, China is on the one hand worried about this spreading to its own country, and they're also seeing these changes as an opportunity, too. Because in a country like Egypt, which had been so buddy-buddy with the United States for so long, it was just understood that China didn't really pay too much attention or try to get involved in Egypt because it was our turf. Now that's all gone. That's all changed. And so you now see a lot of Chinese companies starting to show up in Egypt. The talk about foreign investment deals, to get more of a presence there. When Mohamed Morsi, the new president of Egypt, chose to take his first international trip outside the region, where did he go? China. It's his first port of call because he wants that foreign investment. He wants that Chinese money. So I think a country like China sees a mixed bag here. They're concerned about some elements of this spreading to their own society, but they're also keenly aware of this changing order and the idea that they might be able to have a larger stake in the Middle East because of these changes. Really great question. Yes?
I know you probably know you're going to hear this question today, but with respect to the Innocence of Islam video,
Yes.
all the faults and problems that are going on there right now, how do you think that's going to affect relations?
With the United States?
Yes.
Well, look, I mean, this controversy around that film is not unprecedented, right? There have been a number of incidents over the course of the last 20 years where some depiction of Islam or of the Prophet Muhammad in literature, in cartoons, in film, has sparked controversy. Now, generally these controversies and the protests associated with them have not been mass phenomena, right? And the protests we've seen haven't been anything like the scale of the protests that brought people out in the streets to overthrow these leaders. They've been confined to specific locales. They've been organized by specific fringe groups, which have, found it in some cases a little easier, in some cases more tough to kind of get other people excited about it. But my sense is that we're likely to, this is going to be an episode, and it's going to kind of calm down. It's going to be part of the ebb and flow of the transitions in these countries. And my guess is that when we actually, with hindsight, look back and see what was going on, we'll see a pattern that we saw the last time this happened. In 2005, there was this thing that happened called the Danish cartoon crisis, where a Danish newspaper commissioned from political cartoonists a series of images of the Prophet Muhammad. They asked the leading Danish political cartoonists to depict the Prophet Muhammad as they saw them. And as you can imagine, there was, for context, considerable controversy around Islam in Europe at the time. There were a number of cartoonists who depicted the Prophet Muhammad in not a particularly flattering light, as a terrorist, for example, as a womanizer. And you also, just like now, began to see protests in various parts of the world. Huge protests in Pakistan, protests in Syria, even. When we actually went back and did research to figure out what prompted those protests, what we found is that they were not people just reacting spontaneously to a perceived sense of insult to their religious dignity, but rather these protests were whipped up by specific local groups, extremist groups, that were looking for some pretext, some excuse to protest against the United States. In the case of the protests in Syria around the Danish cartoons, it was actually the Syrian government that allowed these protests to happen in order to get people to pay less attention to the kinds of problems at home that's prompting the popular uprising in Syria now. So, at one level, yes, there is genuinely a sense of insult and grievance on the part of many Muslims about this film. But in the mix also, in these complex transitions, in countries like Libya and Yemen, where we've seen these protests, where there's not even really effective law and order on the streets, there are all kinds of other factors at work in prompting it. So I may be wrong, but I expect that this is something we'll kind of move through. People will ask questions, it'll prompt questions about, oh, is everything going wrong? And then we'll kind of resettle back into the trend we were on. Not that the trend we were on was good or easy, but I don't think that these events will derail this whole process of complex change.
And this is what you told other friends in your conversation there, about the future of Middle East?
Well, I mean, the question I was answering there was very specific to this recent protest around that film. Right, so that hadn't happened. The main thing that I was working on for Secretary Clinton was the question of how the U.S. should deal with the political success of Islamist parties, right, like the Muslim Brotherhood and the very conservative Society groups, because United States foreign policy had difficulty up to that point in figuring out, what its orientation, what our policy towards those kinds of groups should be. There was a lot of concern dating back to even the Iranian Revolution of 1979, right? The images of the Grand Ayatollah Khomeini, the storming of our embassy in Tehran. This concern that Islam in politics was a bad thing for the United States. I was someone who had done research for many years looking at how these Islamist groups, and particularly the ones that participated in the political system, the ones that wanted to do politics through elections, had evolved and changed. And so basically what they were asking me was to do assessments for them about, to what extent can we trust these groups to govern the country on an even keel and not take things in a too extremist of a direction, And my assessment was that, by this point, these groups, for the most part, are genuinely committed to the procedural aspects of democracy. And what I mean by that is that they respect the results of elections, right? They want seats in parliament, so they go to the ballot box, and if they get elected, they go to parliament. And then if they lose the next time around, they go out. They don't put up a fight. They respect those rules, And that is actually a fundamental shift from how they acted, say, 20, 25 years ago. What I'm not so convinced about yet is the extent to which they are committed to that broader conception of democracy that also includes things like respect for human rights, pluralism, the idea of all citizens of the country, regardless of their religious background, having equal citizenship rights. There, I think, there are issues that the United States is going to have to continue to be vigilant around. And also, of course, the broader question, particularly as seen from the vantage point of the Pentagon, say, of is Egypt respecting the peace treaty with Israel? In many ways, that was the mother lode, the linchpin of the U.S. relationship with Egypt. That Egypt had been, under Anwar Sadat in the late 1970s, the first Arab country to recognize and make peace with Israel. And so part of our very close relationship with the Egyptian government was based on that very idea, that this is a country that we can count on to keep peace between Arabs and Israel. And now there are concerns that with the Mubarak government gone, with those guys that were our guarantor of that regional security order out of the picture, will these new guys, will these Islamists, not necessarily well known for their warm, fuzzy feelings towards Israel, will they be willing to maintain that peace treaty? From everything that they've said, and from everything that they've done so far, they seem to have decided that it is in Egypt's interest to stay in the peace treaty with Israel, but one can imagine any number of scenarios down the line as factors spiral in and out, as we contemplate the implications of a military strike against Iran's nuclear facilities and the knock-on effects of that. There are any number of scenarios where you could find the Egyptian government under pressure to rethink that relationship with Israel. So my overall advice to the Secretary was, cautiously optimistic, but, let's not kid ourselves. There's any number of not just rocks, but enormous boulders to be found in this road, and boulders to come spinning down the hill at us completely unseen and unanticipated. Yes?
The storming of the embassy in Libya, is that due to the video or just because?
It's a very good question. I suspect that even our finest intelligence analysts couldn't give you a definitive answer on that point right now. We certainly know that many of those who were involved in the protests seem to be using their anger about that movie as the pretext for doing so. But people are suspicious because this movie had appeared on the internet only a day before. And then that attack on the embassy, which was incredibly precise and well executed, showing evidence of having been planned for some time, suggests that actually this was something that some extremist group had been planning to do for a while, and they used the video as an excuse, right? And I think that's what we're still trying to get at the bottom of. And I'm not sure which is better from our point of view, right? Because if there are groups, if there are extremist groups able to plot and mount attacks against U.S. interests in Libya, it means that there's probably much less stability in the country than we had originally thought. So I think we're still trying to get to the bottom of it. I'm not trying to dismiss the film entirely, because there were certainly protests and demonstrations motivated out of a genuine sense of anger, coupled with just ongoing frustration at the U.S. role in the region that were part of this. But I think we're still trying to figure out exactly what happened at the consulate in Benghazi.
In your opinion, do you think that the Arab Spring inspired, at least partially, the Occupy movement here in the U.S. in any possible way? Or?
These are better questions than my grad students ask. There's been a lot of talk about that, because you can't help but notice the similarities, right? This idea of just a popular outpouring of dissatisfaction with the way the system works. Not necessarily saying we need more of this ideology or that ideology, but just we're pissed off with the way the system works. And indeed, you'll be able to talk to people part of the Occupy movement who will absolutely tell you that yes, we were inspired by what went on in Egypt, and we are mobilizing in solidarity, and we are mobilizing based on their example. I have not yet uncovered any evidence of direct links between activists in Egypt and activists who were part of the Occupy movement. Indeed, when I was in Egypt last summer talking to the people who were at the core of the Egyptian protests and kind of telling them about the Occupy movement, they kind of scratched their heads, slightly puzzled, and didn't quite know what to make of it. But again, it wasn't just confined to, Occupy wasn't just a U.S. phenomenon. There were impulses of that elsewhere around the world. I think at some level, it kind of speaks to the latest version of the broad anti-globalization protests that we've seen in successive cycles since Seattle in 1998. Just people expressing outrage against what they take to be a set of political and economic forces governed by narrow elites that control their lives and that they have no role in. I don't think you can make direct causal links between the two, but you can't help but notice the fact that there was something in the air in 2011 globally around the idea of the people standing up against the system. Yes? And a lot of these art forms, the styles, the tags, are directly inspired by American urban, particularly the New York street art. Absolutely. Indeed, these urban art forms, I think, have been a vitally important tool in the hands of people who don't have an open society in which they're able to speak politically without getting in trouble. Remember that fist that I showed you at the beginning, the April 6th movement? The April 6th movement borrowed that image most directly from a group named Otpor. Anyone know where Otpor is from? Serbia. These were the people in bringing down Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia in 2000. And they would do things like, overnight, they would, all over the city, spray paint a stencil image of Slobodan Milosevic's rather distinctive backside. Everyone would recognize that. It was clear who he was. Walking away, and underneath in Serbian it would say, "It is time." Basically saying it's time for this guy to go. Right? And they would do this under cover of darkness, and everyone would go about their daily lives the next morning, seeing these images all over, and the government had no idea where they came from. But it starts people having it, right? It's a way to get buzz going. And so, great. Sometimes they'll cut off the internet, as the Egyptian president tried to do. Cut off text messaging so that people can't communicate. But the people will find a way to send out the signals to each other. Whether it's text, whether it's spray.
Maybe one last question.
Yeah.
What would you say is some of the biggest impact on the overall quality of life for the people in Egypt? And would you say their living conditions?
Look, their living conditions have not improved. And that's the biggest risk. This is what worries me most, more than anything else. At some level, yes, I'm worried about regional conflict, civil war in Syria, attacks against Iran spiraling out of control. But let's say that doesn't happen, and this new Muslim Brotherhood-led government just continues to try and fix things. My greatest fear is that they prove themselves unable to actually deal with Egypt's single greatest problem, which is not lack of democracy. Right? These people are not out on the streets first and foremost because they wanted the vote. They were out of the streets because the government was not doing anything about the deeply seated poverty and socioeconomic disenfranchisement in the country. The country's tourist industry has taken a huge hit since the Arab Revolution. That was a big source of revenue for them, and people, outsiders, where there's instability, have not come back to the country in large numbers. So the tourist numbers are down. They are facing a looming fiscal crisis. The government's own bank account, if you will, is going to be empty pretty soon. And so there are just tremendous economic woes that Egypt faces. And my fear is that if the government is not able to find some equilibrium and then start the country even modestly in a direction of growth, then some of the same sources of tension and instability that led to this revolution will pour out again. And so, in my mind, it's all about how do we get the economic reform piece right. My most proudest moment, actually, at the State Department was not that cool moment of Hillary Clinton, your head is so big, which was pretty cool. But the fact that I was told, hey, we need a new economic reform initiative for the Middle East. Mandaville, do it. You have $1 billion. Where else do you get told you have a budget of $1 billion, come up with something that will save, the future of Egypt? And so it was designing some sort of $1 billion economic growth plan, aid package that the U.S. would deliver to Egypt. That was, to me, the proudest moment. More so when the White House liked it and President Obama actually put it in his budget request for FY13. And it's now actually being negotiated in the next few days within Congress. So I'm very keenly watching to see whether my little $1 billion baby actually works its way into our next budget.
Listen, thank you to the audience, and also just a word here. I hope you feel it. I know I feel it every time a graduate of Blair comes back, has obviously a close relationship with the school, and he's done well in the world, and we hope that he'll be back many times. This is really wonderful. Came up on the train today. He's going to go back tonight on